discourse on refugees and migrants in the case of Nigeria will be incomplete without reference to our internally displaced persons, victims of Boko Haram's terrible atrocities. The Boko Haram insurgency has caused a huge refugee problem of an estimated 600,000 persons for Nigeria's neighboring nations. In Nigeria, over 2 million internally displaced persons from the northeast live in various camps across the country.
The world is witnessing the highest levels of human displacement on record. Over 65 million people have been forced from their homes, among them 21 million refugees, many of whom lack access to healthcare, food and education. And armed with this knowledge, African leaders joined their global counterparts in New York this week for the 71st UN General Assembly, dubbed the Summit for Refugees and Migrants. But with increasing migration claiming more lives by the day, will the latest commitment signal lasting hope for the world's displaced persons? And what further steps are needed to stem Africa's refugee and migrants crisis? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, driven by conflict, economic hardships and political unrest in their home countries, more refugees and migrants continue to make dangerous journeys in pursuit of better pastures. But the resulting toll on lives these trips are taking is only getting grimmer by the day. Clementine Logan gives us an assessment of the most recent figures.
More than 3,700 people died worldwide during migration in the first half of this year. According to the International Organization for Migration, that's 23% more deaths than during the same period last year. 78% died trying to cross the Mediterranean, many of them in waters connecting Egypt and Libya with Italy. Known as the Central Mediterranean route, it's the deadliest journey for migrants and refugees. But why is this? Well, the IOM points to what it calls new and dangerous smuggling practices. These include piling migrants into unseaworthy vessels or multiple boats at once, and this makes search and rescue operations more complicated. Most of the victims are from Western, Central and Southern Africa, followed by the Middle East and South Asia. However, the origins of a large number of migrants and refugees who don't make the crossing alive are simply unknown. Back to you.
Now, as the world rallies to find a more humane and coordinated approach to solving the global refugee and migrant crisis, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was also present at the 71st UN Summit in New York. At the meeting, he reiterated China's commitment in helping solve the humanitarian crisis around the world by pledging over $100 million to help alleviate the plight of refugees. CCTV's Nathan King brings us more.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang began the official part of his trip by addressing the first ever UN summit on refugees and migrants. He stressed the need to treat every refugee with respect.
Well, this issue is a humanitarian crisis, testing human conscience. We are living in the same global village. Every life is precious. The dignity of every person deserves to be upheld.
Not since the Second World War has the world witnessed so many people fleeing armed conflicts, now more than 65 million. Premier Li, during that time, pledged an extra $100 million on top of already received pledges to help refugees and migrants.
At yesterday's meeting, I pledged $100 million to nations and organizations. Today, I will further promise that in the coming 3 years, through the South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund, China will provide $50 million each year to multilateral humanitarian organizations and relevant UN initiatives. China will also provide another $50 million assistance each year through bilateral channels. In total, China pledges another $300 million in new assistance.
This summit, the first on two on refugees, heard from affected people themselves, like Syrian refugee Mohammed Badran.
From the time I arrived in the Netherlands, I saw how even Europe is struggling with the growing number of refugees. There is intense public fear about refugees, As young refugees, we face this anger and fear every day.
This summit was all about uniting the countries of the world in tackling the refugee crisis. But as Mohammed Badran said, countries are fearful of letting in more. In fact, that fear led to the dropping of a quota that would have required countries to take in 10% of the global population of refugees every year. Instead, now countries will have 2 years to work on individual action plans. Nathan King, CCTV at the United Nations, New York.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guest will analyze the steps taken at the UN General Assembly to resolve Africa's refugee crisis. Stay with us.
South Africa recognizes that in order to adequately address this challenge, we must address its root causes. Underdevelopment is a key driver of the displacement of people and in turn can lead to armed conflict.
That was South Africa's President Jacob Zuma speaking about the place of development in resolving migration and refugee crisis. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to help unpack the resolutions taken at the United Nations General Assembly, I have expert guests standing by. In Lagos, Dr. Ola Bello. He's the Executive Director at the Good Governance Africa. In Cairo, human rights activist Ahmed Naguib. And with me in Nairobi, Tim Howe. He's a Regional Thematic Specialist at the International Organization for Migration. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Tim, let me start off with you and with statistics from the International Organization for Migration, because worldwide about 3,700 people are said to have died during migration in the first half of 2016. 3,000 of those from several African countries, particularly Egypt, Libya. Paint for us the picture, though, when it comes to African migration. What does it look like?
Well, the numbers I think that you're quoting are from our Missing Migrants project, and they actually refer only to the figures of migrants who have gone missing or are dead in the Mediterranean Sea. So this is strictly about sea arrivals to Europe. I think if you ask me to paint the picture of migration and of refugee movements more broadly, we can expect that the numbers are actually quite higher. Not all of the movements that are happening result in death, but what we do see is an increase in irregular migration, people going with increasing levels of frustration, desperation, and thus also relying on the help of people, criminal networks, and going in unsafe ways. I think that is a marking feature which has inspired a lot of the recent debate we have had on migration generally. When
we look at the pictures, though, the numbers in general, what are the numbers looking like?
Well, again, the numbers, you quoted the Mediterranean figure for 2015. We had 3,600 migrants going missing or being dead in the Mediterranean Sea. There was an arrival of around 1 million people just to Europe through the Mediterranean Sea. For this year, we've actually seen that the numbers have declined. So far, up until this month, we have counted around 300,000 people on the move through the Mediterranean Sea. But what we do see still is that the figure that you quoted about the 3,600 dead last year, we are already at 3,200 dead this year, which shows the overall number might decrease. But the way that people are going, it's still very unsafe. The proportion is still very high.
Right. Dr. Ola Bello, we are looking at between 1,300,000 to 1 million people that are crossing through the Mediterranean Sea from sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region, Nigeria, Gambia, and Mali. Talk to us about Nigeria.
Well, I think the picture in Nigeria is pretty much similar to the picture you are seeing right across the continent. I think at least 3 factors are driving this really disruptive wave of immigration we're seeing right across the border crossings from Africa into Europe, but also from the eastern fringes of the European Union. I think the first, of course, is the problem of governance on the continent. We've seen great improvement in that respect, but I think there is still much work left to be done. We've seen quite a few upsurges this year already in terms of the mayhem and destruction being perpetrated by groups like Boko Haram, the Al-Shabaab group in Somalia and elsewhere. All of those are very well articulated. I think the third in the triad, which is not often talked about a lot or not so well articulated, is the economic outlook for Africa at this time, which I think is also driving this mass movement of people that we're seeing. The outlook for Africa in terms of the economic prospect is bright. If you look at the fact that the population in Africa is young, but we're not realizing a lot of this well-known economic potential. I think all of that are now creating a lot of pressure for people.
We're going to come back to the key drivers for migration in just a moment. But Ahmed Nouaguib in Cairo, you've been across the shores when we talk about the migrants going across the Mediterranean. You've been across the shores and you've seen some of these camps where the migrants, and how many of these people still remain in the camps? What is the situation in the camps? What is the whole question of assimilation, the assimilation process, if there is any at all?
Well, there are 2 major entry points to Europe, mostly Italy and Greece. You've got Lampedusa in Italy, where most people drown, where most deceased die on their way to Lampedusa. And then the Greece, you've got the islands and the main port in Greece. The conditions vary from one site to the other. Some, like the one in Piraeus, are not really in living condition, where most basic needs are lacking and no consistent policy to answer the needs of those in those camps are provided. So you've got significant issues in Greece, where it's taking the major hit from the eastern Mediterranean side. You've got a lot of Syrians and Afghanistanis and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. And those are the major ones. The waves from North Africa and Africa are going to Italy, and those are in a little bit much better conditions. However, there's still the trip all the way to Italy is quite perilous, and not many people make it on the way. And then you've got a lot of young minors crossing. Egypt has over 1,200 young unaccompanied minors to Italy.
Right. Team, though, Dr. Bello spoke earlier on about the key drivers for migration away from Africa. He talked about 3 issues in terms of governance, in terms of economic situation, and of course the conflict. Is that what you're finding with the migrants around the continent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one could easily add more factors to that. One could speak also about slow climate change, for example. I think that was something that was recently also acknowledged in New York at the summit. But I think what we should also remember is there is an increase in forced migration or refugee movements, really. But there's also still happening the regular migration, people moving from one place to another. And in Africa, more than any other continent, this has always been a very powerful driving positive force. So when we speak about migration, we need to look at the root causes, but we need to be careful there to look at the root causes for the irregular and the forced migration, whereas we should stimulate and we should actually enhance the channels for legal and regular migration.
Right. In Nouaguib, though, in terms of trying to stem the tide of migration, What needs to be done, though, particularly from an African perspective?
Well, there has to be a partnership between Europe and Africa that is not solely based on a security policy. Right now, the Prime Minister of Italy has lobbied for a 9.2 billion euros in aid to Africa, but mostly focusing on security issues. Dealing with the situation from a security perspective is not a sustainable one, because you have the population of Africa is 1.2 billion, and in 2050 it's going to double, which means the problem is going to double. Dealing with economic issues and dealing with armed conflicts and stabilizing the economy and the politics in Africa will change significantly. Those are not sustainable approaches, and you have those people traveling across and they're not being properly assimilated. Europe has been dealing with this as an ad hoc situation rather than planning. Although in 2010 there were announcements by the EU that Europe's population is decreasing and we need by 2025 around 10 million immigrants across Europe. Now they're having those immigrants, but they're not doing anything with them, and they're not dealing in a proper way to plan, to assimilate them and find jobs for them or education and give them access to the infrastructure. So Africa has to have a good partnership, enhance the opportunities in Africa, and Europe needs to better plan the arrivals and receivals of those immigrants.
Dr. Bello?
I think the solutions have to be found you know, in each of those three distinct pillars that I pointed to earlier. And I think the overarching you know, effort we need to see has to be in the form of closer international cooperation. What do I mean by this? I think there is too much pretense going all around. You look at the situation of a lot of the advanced countries today, you look at their demographic trend, the clear suggestion is that they are going to need you know, workers of the future to continue to pay into those very strong social security pot in those countries. When people are not giving birth, for the average European woman of childbearing age today, I think on the average they give birth to 1.3 children. And there are other parts of the world where the population growth rate is much higher. You've seen the pressure, the pull factor from those regions now coming into full vision. I think we need more and better managed migration. Europe, America, and the other developed parts of the world would need to be less pretensive.
Right.
And we need to discourse how we manage migration in a way that it's more beneficial for sending countries and the countries also receiving them. But here in Africa, I think there is a lot we need to do.
Right.
With regards to security, I think part of the driver is the lack of democracy and lack of economic opportunities, and there is much that I think African leaders can do in this respect together with the private sector to try and help turn this challenging situation around.
Tim, to get your point though, can much be done to stem the tide of migration?
Again, I do think it is important, and just coming back to my earlier point about this, to again distinguish when people say stem migration, that might actually not be what we want to do. This kind of has a connotation on understanding that you can actually stop migration. And I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding. What one can do is work towards managing migration better. But if people want to go and if they're in desperate situations, you will not be able to stop them. That's what we've seen. We need to remember also a big number of the migrants moving, and also a big number of refugees are actually in Africa, are actually in the regions that we're speaking about or that we're representing on the panel. Not all of them are going to Europe. It's actually a small percentage. But those that are going are so desperate that they will find ways to go. So I think in terms of stemming migration, again, I think we need to increase the legal channels. We need to address what the doctor was talking about, situations of conflict that have been going on for many years, conflict in Yemen that erupted that hardly anybody is talking about. These conflict situations need to have political solutions for sure, but in the meantime, we can also do much more by providing alternatives to irregular migration.
You have mentioned, though, an interesting point there and said a small percentage are actually ending up in Europe, but most of the others remain on the continent. Expand on that for us.
Well, I think it's if you look, for example, at the Horn of Africa region, we have Kenya, Ethiopia. I think both countries are amongst the top 10 countries hosting refugee populations for many years. And they have been hosting refugees for many years. Other countries in the region do that. We see migrants, south-south movements moving in Africa, and this is a bigger portion. What has happened is that there have been different developments which have made people go to the north, and there is more focus on the north, and certainly there is a momentum that needs to be addressed. But I think we need to be careful also not to exaggerate. If there would be a good joint international and cross-regional response, as Ahmed I think also alluded to, this could probably manage much better and would be much less of a crisis as we're currently portraying it.
Right. Ahmed, the UN General Assembly, though, this week passed what they call the New York Declaration. Do you think that will have much effect in sorting out the situation?
Well, with countries like Germany and its Prime Minister, its Chancellor Angela Merkel saying that Europe's failure is because it failed to recognize that the refugee issue is a global and moral crisis. You have countries with leaders like that talking at that assembly with a global perspective that it's a global responsibility. Perhaps we might see some reasonable breakthroughs and change in policy and looking at it from a more proactive perspective rather than simply ad hoc.
Right. So Dr. Bello, do you think there could be some reasonable breakthroughs as a result of the New York Declaration?
First, I would have liked to see an outcome from New York that portray more ambition. If you consider the fact that Germany alone over the last year or so has taken in nearly 1 million refugees, especially from Syria and elsewhere. And the pledge coming out of the refugee summit, we've seen over the last 2 days of the General Assembly, in terms of the target, that countries would take in about 110,000 refugees, over the next year. I think, this is just a drop in the ocean when you consider the magnitude of the challenge we're trying to address here. But I think also, one cannot exclusively focus on what more developed part of the world are doing. I mean, there are push and pull factors in terms of what's driving this refugee crisis. I think the more lasting solution actually would come from trying to stabilize the situation in a lot of the places where these refugee flows are emanating from. In Syria, there was a ceasefire declared just a few days ago. It's not sure that's going to hold. As long as we have situations like that, people will try to escape, to protect themselves, and also to try and find opportunities that will make life better for them and their family. In Africa, I think we've seen some efforts, but a lot still needs to be done in this respect. People talk about the reform of the African Union. This is very crucial.
Right.
Crises like the Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and the rest of them that we're seeing in Mali and all that, I think there is a role for Pan-Africanism to play here, and the hope is that they will step up the plate to deliver on this.
Tim, I'll come to you here, though. Do you think the latest commitments from the UN General Assembly, particularly the New York Declaration, do you see that as finally giving some hope to the migrant crisis, particularly when it comes to African migrant situation?
Yes, I tend to agree with the doctor. Much more needs to be done, and I think the action is what we're still waiting for in a way. Having said that, I do think that this summit has been very timely and a very, even in a symbolic way, very, very important, because there has never been a high-level summit on refugee protection and migrants as such. If you look at the declaration, it reconfirms a lot of the international standards, which maybe 10 years ago a lot of us would have said they are not really in doubt. But if you follow this speak of some politicians right now, where political discourse is shifting, people are questioning more and more, do we need to adhere to these standards? There are some concrete suggestions in the declaration about increasing resettlement quota, working together, a global compact which will play out over the next 2 years. My organization being brought into the UN, which I think is important to set the basis, but it sets the basis, nothing more. I would not go as far as to say we have seen any concrete success yet but it certainly sets the basis for it.
Right. Ahmed, I just want to get a final comment from you, though. What is Africa's responsibility, though? Because the UN General Assembly also did talk about apportioning responsibility here for the migrant crisis. What is Africa's responsibility?
Again, I will go to the point of the push and pull, the point of having a strong African Union that is very strong on policies against the coup d'etats in Africa and civil wars and armed conflicts. This is very important, and with a focus on good governance. Those are major challenges that deter foreign direct investments and economic reform. Those issues must be dealt with on the African side. Now, the global international responsibility towards Africa is also important. France's policies in Africa has not changed except on the facade. It has a new colonial attitude and discourse towards Mali and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This has to change to show real accountability on the other side as well. Right.
Dr. Ola Bello?
Well, I think, I mean, I'll speak from the lens I'm most familiar with. I talked about the less well-articulated economic crisis that's also contributing to the democratic deficit and the situation of instability that's driving migrant crisis. The key question for me, can Africa now leverage this really poor economic outlook to try and turn the continent situation around? I think we can do it. We need economies that are better diversified. We need leaders who serve their people diligently whilst they've been democratically elected to lead, and when their time is up, they need to pack up and go.
Right.
Unless we can come together as a continent, bolster the contribution of citizens to these processes and strengthen institutions like the African Union, I think unfortunately we may be saddled with this sort of refugee crisis for quite a while yet.
Tim, how you have the final word on this, on Africa's responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key, and I do think a lot of the solutions lie also with the AU. I would add to that also generally with the regional economic commissions, IGAD, for example, in this region, which over the past years has really stepped up a lot on migration policies and has brought together the member states in this region to find local solutions. There's an AU Horn of Africa initiative on trafficking and smuggling, and this is really African states taking the leadership to address these aspects. I would come back to that aspect about really the potential of migration, the positive sides of it, which we should not forget. And if you look at Africa in terms of free movement, labor migration, there's a lot that can be done within the continent itself that would help African states a lot, and not only in terms of security policies, as Ahmed said, but also in terms of a development angle which we have to look at.
All right, and we leave it there for the moment, but that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But I'd like to thank my guests for their insights in Lagos, Dr. Ola Bello. He's the Executive Director at the Good Governance Africa. In Cairo, human rights activist Ahmed Naguib, and with me in Nairobi, Tim Howe, the Regional Thematic Specialist at the International Organization for Migration. Thank you very much for being on the program. But remember, you can join the conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Goodbye.